In the last lecture module, we looked at Karl Popper. In this lecture module, we turn our attention to Hans Reichenbach. Reichenbach was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1891. He received his PhD from the University of Erlangen in 1915. Though his dissertation was on probability theory, most of his work after 1920 was on relativity theory and its implications. In 1928, Reichenbach founded the Berlin Circle, or, as it was known, the Society for Empirical Philosophy, which included such members as Karl Hempel, Richard von Mises, David Hilbert, and Kurt Grelling. He left Nazi Germany in 1933 when Hitler became chancellor. In 1938, he moved to UCLA, where he remained until his death in 1953. When thinking about the justification of induction, Reichenbach takes a different approach entirely. He says, we've been supposing that the only acceptable justification of inductive beliefs would come from a proof that such beliefs followed from an inference rule that is reliable across time and circumstance. This strategy will fail because all attempts to show the rule to be reliable across time and circumstance implicitly or explicitly rely upon the uniformity of time and circumstance, i.e. the uniformity of nature, or as Reichenbach himself says it in Experience and Prediction, Hume assumes a justification of inductive inference needs to show that inductive inference must lead to success. Hume believed that any justified application of inductive inference presupposes a demonstration that the conclusion is true. It is this assumption on which Hume's criticism is based. His two objections directly concern only the question of the truth of the conclusion. They prove that the truth of the conclusion cannot be demonstrated. The two objections are valid only insofar as the Humean assumption is valid. It is this question to which we must turn. Is it necessary for the justification of inductive inference to show that its conclusion is true? In other words, a pragmatic justification of induction would justify inductive belief on the basis that no matter how the world turned out, induction would be the most reliable means of forming non-demonstrative amplitude inferences. This strategy does not require that induction is in fact reliable, and hence it eliminates the need for establishing its reliability. For instance, suppose nature is reasonably uniform. Well, then induction will work, but any alternative method, say crystal ball gazing, might or might not work. Thus, induction is the best method. Suppose that nature lacks uniformity to such a degree that induction is a failure. In this case, the crystal ball gazing or any other method will fail as well, since if it didn't, it would constitute a uniformity in nature that induction could exploit to be successful. Thus, induction will prove at least as reliable as any other method of non-demonstrative amplitude inference. In other words, if crystal ball gazing outperforms inductive inference in any world, inductive inference can then use crystal ball gazing as a regularity for the purposes of induction. At first blush, the pragmatic justification of induction looks a lot like a transcendental argument, in that it seems to make no presuppositions about the actual constitution or operations of the world in inferring that induction will work at least as well as any other method. However, it's not a typical transcendental argument. Typical transcendental arguments are the following structure: cited truth about the world or one's experiences. Some other fact is necessary for your truth to be possible. Conclusion: the other fact must also be true. For example, Kant's refutation of idealism looks something like this. Your experiences have a temporal order. The possibility of a temporal order of experience necessitates an awareness of something existing from one experience to the next. The possibility of a temporal order of experience necessitates an awareness of something existing from one experience to the next. That permanent something cannot be the self, see Hume. Thus, the permanence must be distinct from both yourself and your experiences, i.e. the external world object. While the claim about the relative efficacy of induction has a transcendental appearance in that it makes no obvious presuppositions about the nature of the world, one can only discover or justify the forced choice characterization of the human condition inductively. Thus, the pragmatic justification requires the ontological relativism of naturalized epistemology. That is, the way in which we motivate a pragmatic justification of induction is that we say human beings must make a forced choice about a non-demonstrative amplitude inference principle, since they must make non-demonstrative amplitude inferences to survive and to thrive. But that itself is a conclusion that one can only discover or justify on the basis of induction, and one can't make any inferences about whether or not that condition would hold in the future without also making an inductive inference. And so we'd have to relativize the pragmatic justification of induction to the assumption of this one feature of the human condition. Now, Quine would probably very much approve of this because this is a pretty minimalistic assumption if it actually gets us to induction. The result of the pragmatic justification then would look something like this. If the human condition is such that I must make non-demonstrative amplative inferences in order to survive and to thrive, then induction looks like the best approach for me to adopt in making those non-demonstrative amplative inferences. Salmon thinks we don't quite get to where we want to go, though, with this argument alone. While Reichenbach's approach doesn't allow us to fix a unique principle for induction, Salmon thinks, it does show great promise as a general strategy for justifying an inductive principle. That is, once we've made the pragmatic justification for induction, all we've established is that we should adopt some or other non-demonstrative amplative inductive principle. It doesn't say which of the many possible non-demonstrative amplative principles we ought to adopt. And in fact, the nature of the world will be a strong determinant of which principle would be the most efficacious, given that we're taking an inductive approach. The strategy gets us to this conclusion that induction looks like a good general strategy given the human condition. But what it doesn't do is tell us how to go about refining that general orientation into a specific methodology for making non-demonstrative amplative inferences.